This is an interview with Alex Peng, an author and researcher who studies how we work and why the standard 5-day model often breaks down. He's written about rest, and he describes working directly with 4-day week companies to build enterprise-wide, sustainable solutions to overwork that improve focus, workflow, and recovery. You can read more about Alex Peng on our website, 6degrees.blog, and our Instagram page, 6 Degrees Away. Thank you, and enjoy the interview.
What was the moment you realized the standard 5-day model was broken, and how has your thesis evolved since you first wrote about rest?
Well, I think that it was a gradual thing, sort of discovering that the sort of both that the 5-day work week sort of had significant issues that were fixable and that were fixable by a 4-day week. I think that for years, people have been sounding the alarm about how sort of the way in which we work and working time isn't really designed for lots of people who sort of are trying to pursue careers and are really passionate about their work, right? Sociologists talk about the concept of the ideal worker, which is basically like an unmarried 24-year-old guy, sort of with no commitments, who can do nothing but grind all the time, put work first, and sort of live life according to the needs of their employer. And labor markets are kind of geared to such people. And as a consequence, working mothers, anybody who has other kinds of multiple responsibilities, workers who are older, all of them have different kinds of challenges accommodating themselves or designing lives that fit within the constraints that that the 5-day week and that modern work culture more generally impose. Now, I think that how it's evolved from my thinking has evolved from rest. The couple critical things are, number one, rest really is about the importance of leisure and downtime in the lives of highly creative individuals. And in that book, I mainly talk about Nobel Prize winners and famous authors and artists and people of that sort. Not people who are in 9-to-5 jobs, and also people who have an awful lot of control over their own time. And one of the things that working with 4-day week companies has taught me is that these are, the problems around sort of working time and the solutions to them are ones that we really have to pursue together. That if you want to create sort of viable, permanent, sustainable solutions to the challenges of sort of overwork, you have to do it at the organizational level, enterprise-wide, not just for your top performers or for, or to particular categories of people. I think that's thing number one. Number two was that was discovering that a shorter work week could be an elegant solution to a bunch of problems for everyone, but also that it was a great way of both creating more time for sort of leisure, recovery, etc., but also that it had great benefits within one's workday, that it served as a kind of forcing function for getting everybody to be more focused, more mindful at work, have fewer distractions, to improve work processes and work culture in ways that delivered benefits not just to individuals, but to teams and to organizations as well. So that's how my thinking about it has evolved.
So you argued deliberate rest is a skill. What does
Mhm.
that look like in a normal week, and what's one habit teams can adopt immediately?
Sure. So, I think that the habit that teams can adopt immediately is layering periods of work and rest throughout the workday. So what this means is having, whether you're adopting a kind of Pomodoro approach where you're working for 25 minutes and having a 5-minute break, or you're alternating longer periods of, let's say, 90 minutes of deep work, which is roughly about as much time as most of us can honestly concentrate really hard on a problem without needing a break, followed by a break of, let's say, 15 to 30 minutes. This turns out to be something that that is great at the team level for a couple reasons. One is most of us overestimate the amount of time that we can concentrate on problems at a really high level. Right? We all think that we can spend 12 or 14 hours a day, right, at the computer or grinding away. The reality is that for almost all of us, productivity really drops off after about 4 or 5 hours. Um, Thing number two is that there is an important social dimension to the challenges of focus and attention. On the positive side, that means that there is a sort of contagion effect to concentration. It's sort of like when you go into the library during finals, you're not necessarily studying with other people, but just being in the presence of other people who are really focused and concentrating helps you focus and concentrate a little bit more yourself. And on the negative side, you know, the average knowledge worker, the most recent studies tell us, is interrupted something like 200 to 250 times per day. Okay? That's an astronomically high sort of number. And most of those distractions and interruptions come from our coworkers. And so, if you arrange these periods of deep work where everybody is focused, everybody's dialed in, nobody's distracting anybody else, you can get an enormous amount done and you can help your team get a lot done. So I think if there is nothing else that, or if teams adopt, I think this strategy of setting aside periods of sort of deep work along with periods of sort of rest and recovery throughout the day is sort of is easy to do. It's something that everybody understands, everybody knows how to do, and everybody, once they start doing it, will be able to sort of support and reinforce each other in making this a habit that sticks and is good for everyone.
So obviously you mentioned the social aspect, except what do you think those break times should be filled with?
That's a great question. What they should not be filled with is like doom scrolling or social media, because the simple answer is, or reason for that is that the parts of our brain that are engaged when we're checking Facebook are often somewhat the same parts that were used when we're dealing with email or doing some other kinds of work things. So it doesn't provide the kind of cognitive break that you would like. What you want is something that is maybe a little physically engaging, that also is mentally engaging, but not in a way that requires you to concentrate, but sort of just naturally kind of captures your attention. And the simple answer that, or this thing that satisfies both of those, is getting out of the office or going for a walk. I think that this doesn't work necessarily if you're like in some industrial zone, but if you're not, even just being able to walk around the office, look out in the middle distance rather than, sort of screens at the end of your hands, even that's going to provide some kind of benefit. The other thing is that in offices where everybody is following the same schedule, having breaks together is a really good thing, because one of the reasons you go to work is to see friends, right? Something like there's a large number of us report that our best friend is someone from work. So you don't want to pursue strategies of like, encouraging deep work at the office at the expense of those relationships, or at the cost of shredding company culture. And so having at least one of those breaks devoted to like a coffee break or having lunch together is a really good thing that helps maintain that culture, that helps balance out sort of the kind of useful isolation of deep work and concentration, while still maintaining some of the sociability of the office. So go for a walk, have a break with friends, maybe go for a short walk with friends. Those are the things that I would recommend.
So those are all things that you can do while you're in the office, on days that you're in the office. What should you be doing during the other 3 days where you're not?
The main thing you should not be doing is checking your work email, or for that matter, sending work email that is not scheduled to go, Monday at 7:50 a.m. Right? Email schedulers are great things for, or if, when you've got this kind of schedule. The Now, what the research tells us is that if you are in jobs that are highly unpredictable or that have a certain degree of or of you know base level of chaos about them or unpredictability. So you're working a retail job. Let's say you are, you're working in the emergency room and you're the intake nurse, right? You never know when you're going to get, someone who comes in with the flu and, a multi-car crash, right? Can't predict that. If you have that kind of job, the kind of sort of the kind of thing you should be looking for outside your work are activities that have a high degree of predictability, that are sort of engaging, that are mentally engaging, that are also kind of physically challenging, because there's an overlap between what's physically and mentally sort of engaging. Um, and that, and therefore sort of both take you away from work mentally, but also give you a chance in some of your life to experience a degree of sort of mastery and control, as sociologists say, right? If you living in an environment in which you don't have those things is not very good for you. So if that's what work is like, then you want to have hobbies or leisure things where you can experience those again. I think that for most of us who are knowledge workers, professionals working in services, that the basic rule is the more time you can spend outdoors, the better. The more time you can spend doing things that are physically challenging, awesome, over the longer run, thinking not just in terms of what you do, this weekend. Having hobbies that you can pursue for a long time is also good, because for a lot of us, part of the charge that we get from sort of leisure that we really enjoy is the ability to improve at it. And so, having things like that, artistic things, music kind of thing, is sort of is psychologically good for sort of all of us. And then the final thing I would say is that being able to disengage from work, from, not check your work email, or not be living in your inbox even when you're at home, you cannot underestimate the importance of that. And even if you're in a kind of job where you need to just check to make sure that there's, nothing lurking in there that's going to blow up on Monday if you don't attend to it now. Have a discipline where you set a timer for 15 minutes, you go in, you triage stuff, forward whatever you need to forward, flag things for follow up, and then at the end of that 15 minutes, you close your laptop. Having that kind of practice will give you some assurance that there's nothing that that you're going to have a crisis meeting about on Monday, without, but also provide some ring fencing and keeps it from turning into, or having that experience where you look up and 90 minutes have passed. So those are the things that I would do.
So why is it that checking your email or your work email on the rest days is so important? Or not checking?
Right. It's important because, number one, we spend a huge amount of our time during the week on email. It's also important as an organizational discipline, that I think that, part of the reason, when you talk to organizations that have moved to shorter work weeks, they all have these rules around no after hours email except under really serious emergencies. And one of the things that people at these companies say is that, you know, I never realized before we implemented this how much of what we thought was urgent was not, and how much of the how much how much overwork is actually just poor planning or bad management, and that once once you improve your processes, you have some rules about what really is an emergency or not, you get your workflows dialed in, it turns out that we can take these technologies, including email, that held out the promise of allowing us to work faster and more flexibly, to communicate instantaneously rather than sending inter-office memoranda that would take hours or a couple days. That all too often have not improved our lives, but simply made them more frantic, and actually help us be more productive in ways that don't burn us out. The final thing is, if you can do this with email, the email problem is one that everybody has, everybody recognizes as a challenge. And if you can get a handle on that, that will go a long way to convincing people who maybe are skeptical that you can make changes in the organization or that these culture changes are things that are worth undertaking, and demonstrate, yeah, this actually has real value, that we can do this. And it opens up the question of, all right, if we can fix this thing that we've always complained about but no one has ever solved, if we can actually make progress on this, what else around here can we change for the better? And it begins to sort of shift people's mindset around what's possible, what can be reformed, how we can benefit from making changes in behavior and practice and technology that will benefit individuals and organizations alike.
So let's say I'm a young person who's really trying to make it big, and I want to work hard and whatnot. Would you still recommend don't check your email on weekends, take those breaks because it's simply more optimal, or would you recommend some sort of other strategy?
I would recommend, first of all, not overestimating the value of working long hours or your capacity to get something from it. And I say this as someone who, in college generally didn't start homework until about 10 p.m. and for whom, in sort of the first half of my career, long hours were just like the cost of doing business, right? I think that the sort of that thinking thinking about your sort of own ability to learn, to deliver, to create value, not mainly in terms of your ability to sit in a chair longer than anybody else, but rather your ability to be smarter, to be more incisive, more thoughtful, to maybe of be a little more collaborative or a little more generous. These are things that, number one, sort of encourage you to think a little bit more deeply about what you're really good at and to develop skills that are going to be useful across your entire life. And I think can put you on a kind of trajectory of professional development that is going to yield better results sort of later on. I think another thing is that, it's worth asking, is the most, all right, in the workplace, how do I demonstrate my worth? How do I demonstrate my professional capacity, my skill, my intelligence? And is that going to come from doing a job in 60 hours, or is it going to be in figuring out how to do this job in 30 hours? Which, if you were a car mechanic, or for that matter, if you were in a marathon, which person would be considered sort of either the more skilled person or the superior athlete? It's the person who's able to do sort of this work in less time. And so I think that if it's clear that you're the person who's figured out how, or you're the person who thinks about your work not in terms of how many hours can I put in, but rather how can I optimize what I'm doing, think about sort of my processes, my workflows, that is a much more sustainable way, an intelligent way of sort of both demonstrating your value, but also learning about your job and becoming better at it than sort of pursuing the model of of endlessly grinding away.
So where does AI genuinely buy back time versus just accelerating busy work, and how do you quantify the net time saved?
Quantify the net time saved. Who the heck knows, right? I mean, how long does it take to write an email? No, yeah, I mean, that varies tremendously depending upon who you're writing, what you're saying, et cetera, right? So I think that one of the challenges we have with all creative and professional work is that tracking it, measuring productivity in this is virtually functionally impossible, right? Productivity in knowledge work is like a black hole. We can see the inputs, we can see the outputs, but what it is that goes on, at people's desks, in people's brains that make them more productive, we can't really say. We have a hard time saying just for sort of ourselves. Now, where does AI play into this? I think that there in the organizations I've worked with, broadly speaking, there are three things that AI does. On the Number one, there's some number of tasks that you can, if you explain them well enough, delegate to generative AI and sort of and you can just take the results and you can sort of run with them, right? You can substitute sort of the technical labor in, rather than sort of human labor. This is in a way, if you think about the way that any of us use a modern maps program, right? You put in where you are, where you want to go, it generates the results. That is that's the sort of almost ideal scenario that you want, right? You're getting a reliable answer that is highly actionable, that's going to save you time, both in terms of the work that you've got to do in order to reach that goal, but also in terms of the work that you had to do in order to come up with the solution. There are only, though, a few instances that most of us will encounter in our work in which that are kind of like that. The second is a much broader range of work where it'll generate something that's kind of useful, that's kind of a decent start, right? It's the okay first draft of an email or a report that you then have to get in and sort of polish up. And then the third version is stuff that you thought was promising but just turns out to be garbage, because generative AI just has all kinds of weird areas where it's good and areas where it's highly unreliable, and it's not clear from the outset which parts of your job you can entrust to AI and which parts you absolutely can't. It doesn't map easily onto what's hard for you or what you think is a difficult task. So you've got to figure this out sort of for your own job or for your own team. But it's also really important that you allow people themselves to do this experimentation to figure out what parts of their work fall into each of those categories. Because no AI consultant knows anyone else's job well enough to automate it away, despite what they will tell you. And no boss knows their subordinates work well enough to tell them how to do it 20% more efficiently or which parts you can automate. You need people to be able to experiment with these tools, to fail fast, to iterate, to figure this out so that they can outsource the stuff that really is genuinely automatable while using the same technologies to augment and improve their own capacity to do the most interesting and highest value added work that they can do for the organization. So, I think that the bottom line is that there is right now no straightforward set of rules that you can always apply for how you should use generative AI. But the basic principle of thinking in terms of what you can automate, what you can augment, and what you still have to do by hand is a good, that's a good heuristic to follow. And then as a company policy, letting workers themselves figure out what parts of their work fall into each of those is the other essential thing.
So lastly, we ask all of our interviewees, how do you define success, both personally and professionally?
That's a good question. I think that the one thing I would say is that you should not think of yourself as a success or as successful with a capital S. I think we are successful at specific things, and but none of us is a success across our entire lives, and that's totally fine. There are some things that I'll put it this way that certainly I've done that I am glad I did and I am proud of. Right, sort of coming up on my 30th anniversary, for example. I have kids of whom who've turned out very well, despite my best efforts. I've got 4 books translated into 24 languages. That's pretty cool. Am I a success on the other hand? I live in Silicon Valley, and the bar for what is a career success is awfully high, right? If you're not a gazillionaire with your own private island that you can escape to, when AGI decides to turn into the Terminator and kill us all, you're not a success. So by that standard, maybe not. But I also think that's not the way to think about your life. So I think so the very word success is something that you have to apply locally to particular things, right? You are a success as a midfielder, or a success as a cook. But are you successful? Don't or ask a different question about your life. Are you living well? Are you doing things? Have you found things that you can genuinely be passionate about, that you cannot imagine not having in your life? And are you doing those things? And if you are, then that's as close to success as I think any you know any reasonable reflective human would say is success.